was 3 days old when my father returned from the war.
In the February the 2nd, 1920 peace treaty between Estonia and the Soviet Union, the USSR recognized the independent Republic of Estonia.
We were cottagers near Otepää and had only one cow and a horse. Pine cones were my only toys.
We go ice skating on the frozen sea. The local smith hammered out blades from old scythes and bed sheets became sails. We'd race out for kilometers until the ice started to crack. Amazing that there were no mishaps.
I couldn't say my R's for the longest time, but when my sister ran off with one of my pine cones, I hollered, "Darn robber, you!" My R's have been perfect ever since.
My father was a baker, but in the spring of 1920 he left that behind. He and 3 of his buddies started bootlegging alcohol to Finland, where there was prohibition. From Sweden they bought a motorboat with an airplane motor so as to outrun the Finnish Coast Guard. Under cover of night, the Finns would hand over a bag of money for the cargo of alcohol. Business flourished, and in 1923, Father bought 2 cars and a farm.
At the age of 10, I had to herd cows for 5 farms. The worst was Voda Farm. During milking, the farmer would sit on a pillow, guarding against servants sneaking some milk. There was no chance of nabbing a carrot either. The garden gate was locked. Never mind trying for an apple. The servants did not eat with the family.
In 1926, I entered Mrs. Hellman's voice class at the Tallinn Conservatory. I planned to dedicate my life to art. I sang in the Estonia choir and formed a splendid band with my classmates. I was the percussionist, singer and leader. We played in restaurants to earn money for the university in Brno.
My father started building our new house. He ruined his health by cutting trees and hauling logs. We had to sell it in 1932 and move to Tartu. Caring my father's health ate away at all of our money. I attended school for shepherds, where we had 4 months of summer vacation.
Several cafes already lined Vabaduja Platz when I started mine. To succeed, my cafe had to be the best. I brought in a Swiss pastry chef and paid him 400 crowns per month, the same wage as a government minister. We opened on February the 2nd, 1937.
I started working odd jobs when I was 16. At 18, I landed a job in a comb factory.
Europe was getting increasingly tense. The European director of Metro Goldwyn Mayer, a family friend, recommended that I close down business and move to the US. The USSR and Germany split Europe between them in the August the 23rd, 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Estonia was to go to the USSR. In October, military bases were established in Estonia. In June 1940, the USSR marched into the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. During a Soviet military training exercise, a soldier touched an electric fence in our field. We were immediately surrounded and the soldiers were ready to shoot. My father arrived home in time and explained electric fencing and what it was used for. The commander in charge hurriedly apologized and explained that the vast Soviet Union had many electric fences, of course, but he hadn't expected something so advanced in backward Estonia. I was in the Tallinn police force. When I left my shift on the morning of June the 20th, I noticed 4 red tanks, one in each corner of Vabaduja Platz, hatches closed and aimed into the square. No soldiers, no people. By the afternoon, a red flag flew atop Pick Herman. I wanted to do something, anything, but there was no point. The Soviets had taken control. On August the 6th, 1940, Estonia was formally incorporated into the Soviet Union and repressions began. People were arrested, tortured, shot. On June the 14th, 1941, 12,000 Estonians were deported to Siberia.
I was roused from a deep sleep by a man waving a gun at me and, in Russian, demanding that I get up. I was to go to another Soviet Socialist Republic. I had 20 minutes to pack and could only take what I could carry. He said, "Don't even begin to dream of the life you have here."
I was jailed in Narva. It was a white night and I was alone in my cell when I heard a child crying. The cry sounded strangely like my son, but how could that be? The door swung open and there stood my wife, son and daughter. We were to be deported. My wife was put into one cattle car and I in another. When the train lurched forward from Lilleküla train station, crowds lined Pärnu Street. They removed their hats in silence as our train passed.
By the second morning, we were in Petseri. Women and children were sent out of the train, and we stood beside the men's car. It was the last time we would see them. The train drove away amid cries of, "We will come back," and strains of national songs and the anthem.
We arrived at Bebenino station near Kaluga on June the 19th and were ordered out. We had to run in formation. It was the only marathon I have ever run in my life. I could hear guns being fired behind our group and news spread among us that those who lagged were being shot. Women and children went east. We were taken to southern Ukraine. A convent had been made into a prisoner camp. The streets were lined with people pelting us with rotten tomatoes, crying out, "Fascists!" The next morning we learned that the war had begun. We were taken back to the same train, but this time we were pelted with rocks. When we were being transported by barge to Solikamski, former Estonian court judge Vatrame got shot. He had gone to the latrine, which then collapsed on him, and he was washed into the river. The guard immediately fired on the judge and reported that the prisoner had tried to escape. The German-USSR war began on June the 22nd, 1941, and that summer, German occupation replaced the Soviets in Estonia.
We were taken to a hut in the village of Nedostupnoy. Tears sprang to my eyes when I realized that this was my new home. The single room was crisscrossed with string on which fish were drying. The stench was revolting. One of the women already living there admonished me, "Don't complain, at least you've got a roof." When we arrived in March, we were left on the riverbank. She spread her big coat on the floor. This was the bed for me and my little daughter.
Men rapidly became walking skeletons and death ran rampant. Graves could not be dug fast enough. When a body was carried out of the camp, the guard would run a long knife in through the ribs of the corpse to make sure he was dead. I became the camp hospital director and was visited by one of the camp's criminal gang leaders and 2 henchmen. "So what's for breakfast?" "You're not getting anything here," I replied. "Rabiata," and on that command the henchmen attacked. Both were soon in pain on the ground, and the leader nervously searched for his knife. "Don't bother," I said. "I'm a trained paratrooper and will snap you in pieces. But if you're still planning to come at me, then hurry up, I'm quite busy." He scurried off and told others, "That damn Estonian is a parachuter." After that, all the criminals were quite polite to me. My mother died of starvation on January the 30th, 1942, in the Tomsk region's village of Medvika. She had desperately struggled to save her children's lives. 2 of my brothers had already died. My sister and little brother died shortly thereafter. It's a miracle that I lived. At an orphanage, I recovered from a stomach disorder and then melted in with the other children. I forgot my mother tongue completely. Its use was forbidden anyway. I was bullied because I was weak, but one time I did strike back at a bully and beat him to a pulp. It was a time of tension. The June deportations had seen most of our relatives carted off to Siberia. My wife and I lived in perpetual fear. Late one night, we heard a bang from the kitchen. We immediately climbed out the bedroom window and ran to hide in the forest. When we cautiously returned the next morning, the scene in the kitchen revealed all. The lid on a jar of blueberry preserves had flown off with a bang, and berry juice dripped down every wall. The berry preserves had started to ferment.
November 1943, and I was in Berlin. Berlin was being bombed. People spoke of the zoo having been bombed, and animals were running in the streets. Fires had melted the streets so much that people got stuck in their tracks. Hunger was everywhere. One day, I saw a crowd around a horse lying on the ground. They were carving off pieces of glass-ridden flesh. I did the same. I went to fetch wine from the wine cellar nearby, only to find myself up to my knees in wine. The Soviets shot at the barrels and were on their knees, drinking up and sloshing about in the wine.
I was accused of belonging to an underground secret society. One of my former police force colleagues had been the informant on 50 people. After 1.5 years in the camp, only 13 remained alive. One at a time, we were called into the warden's office, who read out the decision, "Death by firing squad. Sign it." I signed it, and he asked, "Your hand doesn't shake?" "Fate," I replied. He then took a new piece of paper and read out another decision. Death sentence commuted to 10 years imprisonment. This was done with each of us remaining 13.
My husband was drafted into the Red Army at the beginning of the war. In the fall of 1944, the Germans built a watchtower in our farm garden. We were evicted from our home, and a German officer moved in. We lived in a camp and were ordered to Germany. Many had little children. At Montu Harbor, a German tucked several loaves of bread into my bag. Planes attacked our ship. Our ship fired its missiles. The explosions would flash bright as day. Near us, a ship was hit, and it burned like a flare.
I was a fisherman on the Obi River. In December 1944, the collective farm's beekeeper came to order 5 kilos of fish and invited me to his daughter's wedding. I was smitten by the bride's beauty. She was blonde and blue-eyed, and I was crushed to think that this beauty would soon be a married hag. It left a deep impression on me, as though a beautiful flower was being trampled.
We met up with the front in Germany. A Soviet troop was stationed with us in the schoolhouse. The pursuits, assaults, and rapes started immediately. We were in the same room as a Polish woman with her 16-year-old daughter. Several soldiers immediately attacked her. They were crazed. Women were pulled by the hair. I was attacked too, but my daughter clung round my neck, and my son hung onto my clothes. The children thought I was being murdered. They cried so desperately.
I received temporary ID in Uta. The Uta Izhma camp wardens and wives wanted to learn how to dance, and would I teach them? Natasha, a former ballerina who had been released from camp but who was not allowed further, would be my partner. In order to dissuade suitors, Natasha started rumours that she was syphilitic. The doctors countered that this was untrue. My students were colonels and majors, and I taught them waltz, foxtrot and tango. They just couldn't get the hang of the waltz, though. The plane flew low, shot a single torpedo, then disappeared. That one torpedo hit the engine room of our ship. The ship shuddered and stopped. Near us was an Estonian family, a man, a woman and a child, who we had befriended on the journey. They sat by their suitcases and didn't want to abandon ship. I tried to reason with them. Risk it. We'll take your child with us. I swim well. Come, we'll make it. Oh, we might be separated, and we'd rather perish than separate from our child. And the three of them stayed on the ship. My friend and I jumped together, got on the same raft, and immediately rowed away from the ship. Not long after, the ship broke up. My God, the cries that arose, the cries of death. I had seen much at the front, but this was beyond the worst I had seen there. A column of water shot up and pieces of ship rained down. In May 1946, a miracle happened. I got a letter from my Aunt Vanda. She had learned that Erica and her children had perished, save for one in an orphanage somewhere, and had been searching for me for 2 years. She said I had a home and came to fetch me. When I stepped foot in my home yard, memories came flooding back. I asked why certain things weren't as they had been left. I began to learn Estonian again so that I could start school. At the end of March 1949, the Soviet occupiers deported 22,000 Estonians to Siberia. Most of them were women and children.
From our homes, we were put onto a truck. A friend had wanted to take my youngest son, but she was told, "We take even the dead." It did amount to that. Another woman from our village and a family of a mother, daughter, and grandmother from the next village were added. The grandmother was very ill and had been lifted from her bed on bed sheets into the truck. She couldn't stop groaning from pain. A miller and his son, 11, and mother-in-law, 89, were picked up en route. We sat on our bags in the open truck. My husband was deported in 1949. A flour thief he'd caught lodged the complaint. My children and I weren't on the deportation list, but when my sister-in-law could not be found, they took my children instead. After all, a quota had to be filled. I begged to be taken with them, but my children were taken to Novosibirsk, and my husband and I to Irkutsk. We were finally reunited in the fall of 1949, when the children were brought to us.
A woman named Sonteku lived on a tiny farm. Her husband, a ship captain, had gone missing in the war. During the German occupation, a Soviet prisoner of war was sent to help her since she couldn't cope with the farm work. But she was branded a kulak for using paid labour and was taxed to the maximum. The prisoner of war had no other choice but to marry the woman, 25 years his senior, to avoid being branded a kulak too. To pass the Siberian winter nights, we formed a band. 2 guitars, 2 mandolins, a violin and an accordion. I was on guitar, my brother on violin, and an Estonian girl was on accordion. We'd practice at the schoolhouse where Russian youths would come to dance.
I was freed in August 1949. By that time, my husband had found a new wife in Estonia. I stayed in Mogadon. I had an apartment. My salary supported my parents too, who had no income. In 1954, I met a young man who had just been freed from a camp. I'm not sure if he married me or the apartment. We've stayed together though, and every 3 years we'd go on a paid vacation. These would last almost 6 months because the hazardous nature of my job meant that I got additional time off.
Our coloratura soprano Sylvie Saureste sang Aljabjevis Urbik and Santa Lucia from Naples. Vytautas Malvikas and I sang a duet from the film At 6 o'clock After the War.
The eldest son, home from the Navy on leave in 1945, laid out cards and predicted, "You will have to remain here a long time, but when you've lost all hope, you'll leave on an unexpected voyage." His prediction came true. In 1970, I retired and I moved back to Estonia. Coupons for sanatorium vacations were sent to me from Mogadon for very many years after. There wasn't a sanatorium in the Caucasus in which I hadn't stayed, sometimes many times.
German specialists had just finished installing the most modern equipment in the model farm in Estonia when a dump truck dropped off a cargo of enriched feed. 6 cows died of poisoning from that feed. The agronomist and transport director had used the truck to haul fungicide-treated seed. The prosecutor interrogated us. Everyone managed to dodge blame except me as the Sovkhoz director. I received a warning from the Rakvere Region Party Committee. I had to pay compensation for the cows. The investigator hadn't finished when I showed him the bank transfer of money to the Sovkhoz. Thank God it wasn't the Stalin era. I can only imagine how the court order could have read. The puppet of the German occupier infiltrated the party to devastate Soviet agriculture, supported Soviet enemies, protected 7 capitalists in the Sovkhoz, employed resistance fighters, connived with former SS, which he himself was too, and refused to employ Russians. The Republic of Estonia was re-established on August the 20th, 1991. Estonia joined the United Nations on September the 17th, 1991.
I was like a giddy child when Estonia declared re-independence. My first disappointment came when the crown replaced the ruble. All my savings were gone. My sister died shortly thereafter, and her savings could have bought a house. With the currency reform, her savings only bought her a coffin.
The stories from Estonia's former independence seemed a stretch. But now I can see that what was written during the Soviet era about socialism was false, but what was written about capitalism was true. Over the course of 7 years after re-independence, I had to let half our workers go. When they left, I knew they resented me, even though I too was sad.
My mother decided to go on a game show to win some money. She did win, but it was a car instead. We didn't get the car right away. We had to wait until the winter, when the show aired. We waited all spring and summer, convinced that the world might end before we got the car. All kinds of reporters and photographers showed up when we got the car. It was very embarrassing. We sold the car. The money is going to my education. A tall young man stood behind the door. When he had been my student, he had once stolen the students' lunch money out of my handbag. He had bought himself skis and a 1-kilogram cake, which he ate by himself, in hiding. Now, 30 years later, he has come to ask my forgiveness and pay back the money. He said he's married with 6 kids, and in the summer, he cares for abandoned children. He has rebuilt his grandfather's farm into a Christian retreat, supported by the mission and by Sweden. He said he's religious and that God helps them. Of course, I didn't take his money. We embraced and cried. I told him that he was forgiven.